The alarm didn't sound. Arthur Calloway woke at 5:32 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September because his body had been waking at 5:30 for 53 years, and no amount of retirement grief or silence could break that rhythm. He lay still for a moment in the dim bedroom listening. The house made its small morning noises. The refrigerator hummed, a branch scraped against the window. The central heat kicked on with a low mechanical sigh, all of it familiar, all of it empty. He turned his head and looked at the other side of the bed. The pillow there was smooth and untouched, the way it had been for 3 years. Elaine's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand folded neatly beside a paperback novel she'd never finished. He hadn't moved them, couldn't. Arthur sat up slowly, his knees protesting, and reached for the framed photograph on his own nightstand. 3 faces smiled back at him, Elaine radiant in a blue summer dress, himself younger, broader, with dark hair and sharp eyes, and between them a boy of maybe 12 with his mother's smile and his father's jaw, Benjamin. He set the photo down carefully as if it might shatter and stood. The morning routine was unchanging. Shower, shave, coffee black no sugar, toast with butter, no jam. He dressed in work boots, faded jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and a canvas jacket that smelled faintly of motor oil and old tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking in 1987. Outside, the September air was cool and clean. The sun was just beginning to lift over the ridge to the east, casting long shadows across his 8 acres of land. The house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, half a mile off the main road, surrounded by pine trees and the kind of quiet that most people pay good money to find. Arthur walked to the garden. It sat behind the house, enclosed by a low fence that sagged in places. The gate hung crooked on its hinges. Inside the rows were a mix of life and neglect. The tomato plants near the fence were still producing their fruit, small and red and perfect. The herbs by the kitchen door, rosemary and thyme and basil, grew wild and fragrant. But the rest, the zucchini, the peppers, the lettuce, all of it had gone to seed or died back or been overtaken by weeds. Elaine had planted this garden 32 years ago, the summer they moved into the house. She'd drawn it all out on graph paper, first measuring sun angles and drainage patterns like she was planning a military operation. Tomatoes near the fence for maximum light, herbs by the door for easy access while cooking, zucchini in the far corner because she'd said they need room to spread out like children. Arthur knelt beside the tomato plants and pulled a few weeds from around the base. His hands moved slowly, methodically. The dirt was cool and damp beneath his fingers. He used to help her out here every weekend. She'd talk while they worked about everything and nothing. Neighborhood gossip, plans for dinner, a memory from her childhood. He'd mostly listen, occasionally offering a comment or a laugh content, to be near her while the sun warmed his back and the smell of earth filled his lungs. Now, he came out here most mornings, but he didn't do much, just stood, looked, touched a leaf or two, then went back inside. He stood now, brushing the dirt from his hands, and walked back toward the house. At 7:15, he drove into town. The truck was a 2003 Ford F-150 dark blue with 198,000 miles on it and a transmission that was starting to slip. He'd been meaning to get it looked at for months, but he kept putting it off. Where did he really need to go? The VFW Hall sat on the corner of Main and Birch, a squat brick building with a faded American flag hanging from a pole out front. Arthur parked in his usual spot, third from the left, and walked inside. The Wednesday morning coffee group was already underway. 6 men, all north of 65, sitting around a folding table near the back. cards, coffee, and conversation. The same ritual every week for as long as Arthur could remember. "Morning, Arthur," said Jack Morrison, a former Army helicopter pilot with a gray beard and a voice like gravel. "Morning," Arthur replied, pouring himself a cup from the ancient Mr. Coffee machine on the counter. He took his seat. They played gin rummy badly and talked about the usual things: the weather, football, someone's grandson who just enlisted, the rising cost of everything. Then Dorothy Hines came up. "You hear about Dorothy?" Jack asked, laying down 3 queens. Arthur looked up. "What about her?" "Someone broke into her place Saturday night. She woke up and there was a man standing right next to her bed." The table went quiet. "Jesus," someone muttered. "She screamed," Jack continued. "The guy ran, but she had a heart episode. Spent 2 days in the ICU. She's home now, but she's not the same, you know." Arthur set his cards down. "Dorothy Hines lives on Crescent Road. That's her. About 4 miles from your place, Arthur." Arthur nodded slowly. He'd known Dorothy for years. She taught 4th grade for 30 years before retiring. Lived alone since her husband passed. A kind woman who baked pies for church functions and never missed a vote. "3rd break-in in 6 weeks, Jack said. "All out on those rural roads. Sheriff says they're targeting older folks living alone." The conversation continued around him, but Arthur had stopped listening. He finished his coffee, folded his cards, and stood. "Leaving already?" Jack asked. "Got an errand to run." He drove directly from the VFW to Blue Ridge Arms. The gun shop sat on the eastern edge of town, just past the old sawmill in a strip of commercial buildings that had seen better days. The parking lot was gravel and mostly empty. Arthur pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. He hadn't owned a firearm in over a decade. When he retired, he'd sold most of his personal collection. Kept one hunting rifle, but that had gone to Benjamin when the boy turned 18. After Benjamin was gone, Arthur hadn't wanted anything in the house that could make that kind of decision easier for anyone else. But now, sitting alone in a house at the end of a long driveway, knowing someone was out there breaking into homes, standing over beds, he got out of the truck and walked toward the front door. The bell above the entrance jingled as he stepped inside. The shop was exactly what you'd expect. Mounted deer heads on the walls, a long glass counter displaying handguns, racks of rifles and shotguns along the back, the smell of gun oil and leather, fluorescent lights overhead that buzzed faintly. 3 young men were working the floor, the first tall and bearded, wearing a tactical vest over a black t-shirt, noticed Arthur immediately. He elbowed the guy next to him, a shorter man with a high and tight haircut and an AR-15 manufacturer's logo on his shirt. The third, younger than the other 2, stood behind the cash register, stocking boxes of ammunition onto a shelf. Arthur approached the counter slowly. He removed his cap and held it in both hands the way his father had taught him to do when entering any place of business. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm, steady, with the faint remnant of a southern drawl that 4 decades in the military had mostly smoothed out. The bearded one, whose name tag read Tyler, leaned against the counter and looked Arthur up and down. "Morning," Tyler replied. "What can we do for you?" "I'm looking for a home defense firearm," Arthur said. "Something reliable, something I can keep in a lockbox beside my bed." Tyler glanced at the other man whose name tag read Marcus, and something passed between them. A look, a smirk. "Home defense," Tyler repeated as if testing the words. "You sure you're not looking for like a walking cane with a built-in flashlight or something?" Marcus laughed, not loud but enough. Arthur didn't react. He simply said, "I'm sure." Tyler reached beneath the counter and pulled out a compact 9mm handgun. He set it on the glass with a light thud and began talking fast, rattling off specifications with the enthusiasm of someone trying to impress a friend rather than help a customer. This is a Glock 43X, slim profile, 10-round mag, easy to conceal if you're worried about. Arthur reached for the weapon. Tyler pulled it back slightly, just out of reach. Whoa, easy there, Gramps. Let's make sure you can hold it steady first, yeah. He turned to Marcus and grinned. Think they make one with a vibration alert, you know? So he doesn't forget it's in his hand. The laughter came again, louder this time. From behind the register, the youngest one, Devin, chimed in. Honestly, sir, Devin said, his tone light, almost friendly. You might be better off with one of those medical alert things. You know, he mimed, pressing a button on his chest. I've fallen, and I can't find my Glock. Ma. All three of them laughed. Arthur looked at each of them in turn. Tyler, Marcus, Devin. His expression didn't change. There was no anger in his eyes, no embarrassment, no visible hurt. Just something quiet and level, something they were too young and too careless to recognize. Is there someone else I could speak to? Arthur asked politely. Tyler shrugged. Owner's not here, out running errands. You're stuck with us, old-timer. Arthur nodded once slowly. Then he turned and walked to a folding chair near the front window. He sat down, straight back, knees together, and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind with a wrap-around strap and pages that had been thumbed soft over years of use. He uncapped a pen and began to write. Tyler and Marcus exchanged looks. Tyler made a spinning gesture near his temple, the universal sign for crazy, and they both turned back to the counter, laughing under their breath. Arthur wrote for 38 minutes. He didn't look up, didn't shift in his seat, just sat there, pen moving across the page in neat, unhurried lines. At 9:47 a.m., the front door opened. A black Ford F-25 pulled into the parking space directly outside, and a man stepped through the entrance carrying a cardboard box under one arm and a paper bag in the other. Ray Dalton was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders with a gray crew cut and the kind of posture that didn't happen by accident. He wore jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd built things and broken things and understood the difference. He stepped inside, intending to say something to Tyler about the inventory shipment, when his eyes drifted to the folding chair near the window. He saw Arthur. The box slipped from under his arm and hit the floor with a heavy thud. The paper bag followed, sandwiches spilling out onto the tile. Ray's face went blank. Not shocked, not confused, just completely, instantly recalibrated, the way a soldier's face changes when they hear a specific sound in the distance that no one else recognizes. Tyler started to speak. Hey, Ray, this old guy came in earlier wanting. Ray raised one hand without looking at him. Tyler's mouth snapped shut. The entire store went quiet. Ray Dalton walked across the floor with a stride that was unmistakably military. His back straightened, his chin lifted, his arms fell precisely to his sides. When he reached the chair, he stopped exactly 2 paces away, drew himself to full attention, and said in a voice that was equal parts reverence and disbelief, Colonel Calloway. A pause. Sir, it's an honor. Arthur looked up from his notebook. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. At ease, son, he said quietly. I'm just here to buy a pistol. Ray Dalton didn't move. Not yet. He stood there at attention for 5 full seconds, his jaw tight, his eyes glassed over with something the 3 employees behind him had never once seen from their boss. Emotion, raw, unguarded, genuine. Tyler mouthed the word Colonel to Marcus, eyes wide. Ray finally relaxed his posture, but only slightly. He pulled up another folding chair, dragged it across the floor, and sat down directly across from Arthur, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He spoke quietly, but the store was so silent now that every word carried. "Boys," Ray said without turning around, "do you have any idea who this man is?" None of them spoke. Ray nodded slowly. "This is Colonel Arthur J. Calloway, United States Marine Corps retired." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. He commanded 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, Iraq, November 2004, one of the bloodiest urban battles American forces have fought since Hughes City. Another pause. "I was a corporal attached to his battalion, 23 years old, dumb as a bag of hammers, scared out of my mind." Arthur raised a hand gently. "Ray, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, sir." Ray turned back toward his employees, his voice steady and unyielding. "On the 3rd night of the operation, my squad got pinned down in a building that was rigged to blow. We radioed for support. No one could reach us. The streets were a kill zone. Every route was compromised." He stopped. His voice cracked just once and he cleared his throat before continuing. "Colonel Calloway came himself, not a captain, not a lieutenant. The battalion commander personally moved through 4 city blocks under fire the entire way to reach our position." Ray looked down at his own hands. "He pulled 2 of my men out of that building with his own hands. One of them had taken shrapnel to the neck and couldn't walk. The colonel carried him." The silence in the shop was absolute. Ray stood. He walked behind the counter and returned with a framed photograph that had been hanging on the wall near the register. It showed a group of Marines in full combat gear, dirty and exhausted, standing in front of a shattered building. In the center was a younger Arthur Calloway, taller, broader, with the same blue-gray eyes, holding the shoulder of a young Marine whose head was bandaged. That young Marine was Ray. "This photo was taken 6 hours after he saved our lives," Ray said. "I've had it on this wall since the day I opened this shop." He set the frame down gently on the counter. Then he looked directly at Tyler. "Now, tell me again what you said to this man when he walked in." Tyler's face had gone completely white. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Marcus looked at the floor. Devin gripped the edge of the register like he was afraid the ground might give way beneath him. Arthur spoke up, his voice still calm. "Ray, it's all right. They didn't know." "That's the point, sir," Ray said. "They didn't know, and they didn't care to find out." He turned back to the 3 of them, his voice controlled but hard underneath. "A man walks into your store, a customer, a citizen, an American, and you mocked him. You made jokes about his age, about his hands, about his ability to defend his own home. You didn't ask his name. You didn't ask about his experience. You looked at him and decided he was less than you." Ray's tone was the tone of a man who had learned what respect meant, not in a classroom, but in a city that was burning. "Colonel Calloway has more trigger time than every person in this room combined, including me. He qualified expert on every weapon platform the Marine Corps fielded for 3 decades. He taught marksmanship at Quantico. He trained the men who trained me." He paused, "And you told him to get a medical alert button." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need description. It was the sound of realization, the sound of shame settling into bone. Tyler stepped forward first. His hands were shaking. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry. I had no right to speak to you that way." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're young," he said. "Young people make mistakes. What matters is whether you learn from them." Marcus came next, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, sir. That was wrong." Arthur accepted with the same quiet nod. Devin didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, blinking hard, his jaw working, like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. Then he walked out from behind the counter, crossed the room, and extended his hand. Arthur took it. Devin held on for a moment longer than necessary. When he finally pulled away, he wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and returned to his post without a word. Ray put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Now, Colonel," he said, "let's get you set up properly." Ray led Arthur to the back of the store, past the rifle racks and the ammunition shelves, into a quieter section where the higher-end firearms were displayed in locked cases. "What's your situation, sir?" Ray asked. "You mentioned home defense," Arthur explained. "The break-ins, the rural roads, Dorothy Hines waking to a stranger standing over her bed. The fear that had settled into the community like morning fog, quiet and pervasive." Ray listened, without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When Arthur finished, Ray opened one of the cases and removed a compact handgun. "Sig Sauer P320, he said. 9mm 15-round capacity, modular grip so we can adjust it to fit your hand. Reliable as they come and accurate enough that you won't have to think twice." He set the weapon on the counter between them. Arthur picked it up. His hand moved with practiced ease, finger off the trigger, muzzle pointed in a safe direction. He checked the chamber, tested the slide action, examined the sights. Ray watched, and in that moment he saw it again. The same movements he'd watched 20 years ago in a different country, under different circumstances. Muscle memory that didn't fade, training that became instinct. "This'll do," Arthur said. Ray nodded. "I'll also set you up with a biometric lockbox. Fingerprint access opens in under 2 seconds. You keep it next to the bed, and if someone comes through that door at 3 in the morning, you'll be ready." He paused. "But you already know that, sir." Arthur smiled faintly. "It's been a while." "It doesn't leave you," Ray said. "Not really." They moved to the counter, and Ray began processing the paperwork. While the background check ran, Ray pulled up a stool and sat across from Arthur. "How have you been, sir?" he asked. "Really?" Arthur considered the question. Most people asked it without wanting a real answer. Ray wasn't most people. "Elaine passed 3 years ago," Arthur said. "Pancreatic cancer. It was fast." Ray's expression shifted. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." "No reason you would. You have family nearby." Arthur hesitated. Then quietly, "I had a son, Benjamin. He was a Marine. Iraq, 2008. Ray waited. "He came home different," Arthur continued. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something heavy. PTSD nightmares. He tried to hide it the way we all do, but it got worse. He stopped. The silence stretched. 2 years ago, he took his own life. The words hung in the air. Ray closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "Colonel, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say," Arthur replied. "It is what it is." But Ray shook his head. "No, sir. It's not just what it is. It's a failure. Our failure. The system's failure. We send them to war, and we don't bring them all the way home." Arthur looked at him, and for the first time, something in his face softened. "Elaine used to say the same thing," he said. "She fought harder than I did to get him help. VA appointments, counselors, medication. But Benjamin, he was stubborn, like me." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Elaine died 6 months after Benjamin. The doctor said cancer, but I think it was a broken heart." Ray reached across the counter and gripped Arthur's forearm the way one Marine grips another. "You're not alone in this, sir." Arthur nodded. "I appreciate that, Ray." The background check cleared. Ray packaged the Sig Sauer, and the lockbox refused to let Arthur pay full price, insisted on the employee discount despite Arthur's protests, and walked him to the truck personally. Before Arthur drove away, Ray leaned into the open window. Colonel, if you ever need anything at all, you call this shop. Someone will be at your door in 30 minutes. Arthur thanked him. Then he said something Ray would never forget. The way you treat the people who can do nothing for you, Ray, that's who you really are. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot. Ray stood there until the truck disappeared around the bend. Then he walked back inside and locked the front door. He flipped the open sign to closed. Tyler looked up confused. Ray, it's only 10:30. I know what time it is, Ray said. Sit down, all three of you. They sat. For the next 2 hours, Ray Dalton told them stories they'd never heard. He told them about the men and women who come home from war and carry it silently for the rest of their lives, about the veterans who walk into stores and restaurants and government offices every day and are treated like they're invisible, like their age is a punchline, like their service is something that expired. He told them about Colonel Arthur Calloway's career, 34 years in the Marine Corps, tours in Grenada, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, a Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a Legion of Merit, a man who had buried friends in 4 different decades and never once asked for recognition. He told them that Arthur had written personal letters to the families of every Marine killed under his command, every single one, by hand, not form letters, not condolence cards signed by an aide, handwritten letters, sometimes 4 or 5 pages long, describing the specific qualities of the fallen Marine, the way they laughed, the things they said that kept morale up, the moment that defined their courage. Ray knew this because he'd seen one of those letters himself. It had been written to the mother of Lance Corporal Cameron Mitchell, who had died 2 weeks after the Fallujah rescue, not from his wounds, but from an infection that the field hospital couldn't stop. Ray had attended the funeral. He'd seen Cameron's mother holding that letter against her chest, like it was the last warm thing in the world. He'd never forgotten it. When Ray finally finished talking, the shop was silent. Tyler sat with his head in his hands. Marcus stared at the floor, his jaw tight. Devin just looked smaller, like something had been removed from him that he hadn't known he was carrying. Ray stood and walked to the wall behind the register. He took down the framed photograph of Arthur and the Marines from Fallujah and set it on the counter in front of them. "This is who he is," Ray said, "and you laughed at him." No one spoke. Ray pulled a wooden plaque from beneath the counter. It was unfinished, just raw wood, but he'd already carved words into it with a router. "Every person who walks through this door has a story you don't know. Treat them accordingly. This goes above the door tomorrow," Ray said. "And from now on, every customer who walks in here gets treated with respect. I don't care if they're buying a $1,000 rifle or asking about a used revolver. I don't care if they're 20 or 90. You ask their name, you listen, you help." He looked at each of them, understood. They nodded. Ray sent them home early. That night, Devin couldn't sleep. He lay in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over. The laughter, the jokes, the look on Arthur's face when he'd sat down in that chair, the look on Ray's face when he'd walked in. Devin was 21. He'd grown up in this town. His father had left when he was 6. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. He'd barely graduated high school, and the only reason he had this job was because Ray had given him a chance when no one else would. He didn't know much about the military, didn't know much about war, but he knew his grandfather, Sergeant Frank Harding, Army, Desert Storm, 1991. Devin had been 8 when his grandfather died. He remembered the funeral, the flag, the rifle salute, but what he remembered most was the last year of his grandfather's life. Frank had lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. Devin's mother would take him to visit on weekends. Frank never talked about the war, never wore his uniform, never went to the VFW. He just sat in his recliner and watched TV and drank beer until he fell asleep. One night, Devin's mother found him collapsed in the driveway. Heart attack. He'd been trying to take the trash out. They called 911, but by the time the ambulance arrived, Frank was gone. No one had known he was a veteran until after he died. No one had known his name. Devin got out of bed. He found his phone and searched for Arthur Calloway's address. It wasn't hard to find. Small town. The next Saturday morning, he drove out to Arthur's house. The driveway was long and gravel winding through pine trees. The house was small, simple, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Behind it, Devin could see a garden enclosed by a low fence. He parked and walked to the front door, knocked. Arthur answered after a moment. He was wearing the same work boots and flannel shirt. He looked at Devin without surprise, as if he'd been expecting him. "Mr. Calloway," Devin said. "I'm Devin, from the shop." "I remember." Devin shifted his weight. I wanted to apologize again, and I wanted to ask if you needed help with anything around the property, whatever you need." Arthur studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." They walked through the house and out to the garden. Arthur showed him the rows, the tomatoes, the herbs, the empty spaces where other things used to grow. "My wife planted all of this," Arthur said. 32 years ago, she had a plan for every row. He pointed to the far corner where weeds had overtaken everything. Zucchini used to grow there. She said they needed room to spread out, like children. He paused. "My son Benjamin planted those with her before he joined the Marines." Devin looked at the weeds, the broken fence, the dry soil. "I could help you fix this," he said. "If you want." Arthur looked at him. Then he handed him a pair of work gloves. "Let's start with the weeds." They worked side by side for 3 hours. Devin pulled weeds. Arthur raked the soil. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are working toward the same thing. When they finished, Arthur made coffee. They sat on the porch, and Devin told him about his grandfather, about Frank Harding, about the funeral, about the way no one had known. Arthur listened. When Devin finished, Arthur said, "I know his name now." Devin's throat tightened. "Tell me about him," Arthur said, and Devin did. When he finally left, it was late afternoon. He drove home slowly, pulled over on the side of the road, and sat in his truck with his head on the steering wheel. Something inside him had shifted. He didn't know what to call it yet, but he felt it. The next weekend he came back, and the one after that. Within a month they had cleared the entire garden, turned the soil, planted new rows, tomatoes, herbs, zucchini in the far corner, the spot Elaine had chosen, the spot Benjamin had helped dig. One afternoon while they were working, Devin asked, "Why didn't you say anything that day in the shop? Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Arthur sat down his trowel and thought about it. Then he said, "Because a man who has to tell you who he is, isn't." Devin didn't respond right away. He just turned back to the soil and kept planting. But later, driving home, he pulled over again. Same spot, same truck, same feeling. Only this time he didn't cry. He smiled. The weeks passed, and the garden began to change. What had been a monument to loss slowly became something else, something alive. Tyler stopped pretending to be someone he wasn't. After that day at the shop, he started asking customers their names before asking what they were looking for. He started listening more than talking. He enrolled as a volunteer at the VA hospital, showing up every Saturday morning at 7 and staying until they sent him home. Marcus joined a veterans outreach program, organizing a weekly support group that met at Blue Ridge Arms after hours. 12 veterans showed up to the first meeting, 20 to the second. By the fourth meeting, they had to move to a larger space. Ray hung the wooden sign above the door just as he'd promised. Every person who walks through this door has a story you don't know. Treat them accordingly. It became more than a policy. It became a philosophy that shaped everything they did. Arthur continued his quiet routine. He woke at 5:30, tended the garden, drove to the VFW on Wednesdays. But now there was something different. Devin came every weekend, sometimes twice a week, and slowly others began to join them. It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday in early November when Arthur heard the sound. He'd been asleep, but not deeply. Sleep had been shallow for years, the kind where you're half in and half out, aware of every creak in the house, every shift in the wind. This sound was different. Metal on metal, quiet but distinct. Someone was trying the lock on the back door. Arthur's eyes opened. He didn't move, didn't reach for the light, just listened. The sound came again, a scraping, a jiggle, then a soft click. The door opened. Arthur sat up slowly, his hand moving to the biometric lockbox on the nightstand, his thumb pressed against the scanner. The box opened with a faint mechanical whisper. He lifted the Sig Sauer, checked the chamber by feel. It was loaded. He'd kept it that way since the day he brought it home. Footsteps, careful, deliberate, moving through the kitchen. Arthur stood. His knees protested, but he ignored them. He moved across the bedroom floor in his bare feet, silent the way he'd been trained to move 40 years ago in rooms that were far more dangerous than this one. He reached the bedroom door and stopped, listened. The footsteps had paused. Whoever it was had stopped in the living room. Arthur stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, but his eyes had adjusted. He could see the outline of furniture, the shape of the doorway ahead. He moved forward, keeping the weapon low finger off the trigger. When he reached the living room, he saw the figure. A man, young, thin, standing near the coffee table holding something in his hands, a flashlight. He was looking at the framed photographs on the mantel. Arthur raised the Sig Sauer and spoke, his voice calm and level. "Don't move." The man froze. "Put the flashlight on the floor," Arthur said. Slowly. The man obeyed. The flashlight clattered against the hardwood. "Hands where I can see them." The man raised his hands. Arthur reached for the light switch and flipped it. The living room flooded with light. The man standing in front of him was maybe 28-30 at most. He wore a dirty jacket, jeans with holes in the knees, and boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles. His face was gaunt, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. But it was the eyes themselves that made Arthur pause. He'd seen those eyes before, in mirrors, in the faces of men sitting beside him on transport planes, in photographs sent home to families who would never understand. "You're not armed," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. The man shook his head. "No, sir." Arthur lowered the weapon slightly, but he didn't put it down. "What's your name?" "Key." "Ethan. Ethan Graves." "Why are you in my house, Ethan?" Ethan's jaw worked. His hands were still raised, trembling slightly. "I'm hungry," he said finally. I was looking for food. I wasn't going to hurt anyone, I swear." Arthur studied him. The trembling hands, the hollow cheeks, the boots. "You're a vet," Arthur said. Ethan blinked. "How did you—" "I can tell." Ethan's hands lowered slowly. His shoulders sagged. "Army," he said. "Ranger Battalion, Afghanistan 2021. Arthur nodded. He walked to the kitchen, set the Sig Sauer on the counter safety on, and turned to face Ethan. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." Ethan didn't move at first. He just stood there staring at Arthur, like he'd spoken a language Ethan didn't understand. "I said sit down," Arthur repeated. Not harsh, just firm. Ethan sat. Arthur made coffee the way he always did. Black, no sugar. He poured 2 cups and brought them to the table. He set one in front of Ethan and sat down across from him. "Talk," Arthur said. Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup, absorbing the warmth. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then slowly the words started coming. He talked about Kabul, about the evacuation in August 2021, about the chaos at the airport, the crowds, the desperation, the bomb that killed 13 service members and hundreds of civilians. He talked about the friend who'd been standing next to him when the blast went off, about holding him while he bled out on the tarmac. He talked about coming home, about trying to readjust, about the nightmares that wouldn't stop, about the VA appointments that didn't help, about the job he couldn't keep, about the apartment he lost, about the family that stopped calling because they didn't know what to say. "I've been living in my car for 4 months," Ethan said, "but the transmission died 2 weeks ago, so now I'm just out here." He looked at Arthur and his voice cracked. "I wasn't always like this, sir. I swear, I'm not a criminal. I don't know what to do anymore." Arthur listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened. When Ethan finally stopped talking, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood something that didn't need to be explained. Arthur set his coffee cup down. "My son was a Marine," he said. "Iraq 2008. He came home with PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, the whole 9 yards." He paused. "I didn't know how to help him. I tried, but I didn't know. I thought he just needed time, that he'd work through it. Marines are tough, right?" His voice wavered just slightly. 2 years ago, he put a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Ethan's face went pale. "My wife, Elaine, she died 6 months later. The doctor said cancer, but I know better. It was grief. She carried it, and it killed her." Arthur looked at Ethan, and for the first time, his eyes were wet. "I tell you this because I need you to understand something. You're not broken, you're not weak, and you're sure as hell not alone." Ethan's hands shook. He set the coffee cup down before he dropped it. "What do I do?" he whispered. "You start by not being out here alone," Arthur said. "You let people help you." He stood and walked to the phone on the counter. He dialed a number he'd saved weeks ago. Ray answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Ray, it's Arthur." "Colonel, it's 3 in the morning. You okay?" "I'm fine, but I need you to come out to my place and bring Devin." "What's going on, Masao?" "I'll explain when you get here. Just come." "On my way." 30 minutes later, Ray's truck pulled into the driveway. Devin was with him, looking confused and half asleep. They walked into the house and stopped when they saw Ethan sitting at the kitchen table. "Ray Devin," Arthur said. "This is Ethan Graves. He's a veteran, and he needs help." Ray looked at Ethan, then at Arthur, then back at Ethan. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me what you need," Ray said. Over the next 3 hours, they made a plan. Ray knew a guy who ran a transitional housing program for veterans. He called him right then at 3:30 in the morning and got Ethan a bed by sunrise. Devin drove to the 24-hour Walmart and bought Ethan a week's worth of closed toiletries and a phone. Arthur made breakfast, eggs, toast, bacon, enough for all 4 of them. They sat around the table and ate together as the sun came up. Before Ethan left with Ray, he turned to Arthur. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you help me? I broke into your house." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone should have helped my son," he said, "and they didn't." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He nodded once, unable to speak, and followed Ray out to the truck. In the weeks that followed, Blue Ridge Arms became more than a gun shop. Ray installed a coffee station in the corner. He put up a bulletin board with information about VA resources, job openings, counseling services. Every Wednesday morning, veterans started showing up, not to buy guns, just to talk, to sit, to be around people who understood. Tyler continued his work at the VA hospital, spending every Saturday helping however he could. He learned the names of the older veterans. He sat with them during their appointments. He listened to their stories. Marcus's support group grew. Within 3 months, they had 40 regular attendees, men and women from every conflict since Vietnam. They met at the shop after hours and talked about the things they couldn't talk about anywhere else. Devin kept working with Arthur in the garden, but now other veterans came too. Ethan, a former Navy corpsman named Sarah, a Marine who'd lost his leg in Fallujah. They planted, they weeded, they talked or didn't talk depending on the day. By spring, the garden was alive again. Tomatoes climbed the fence, herbs filled the air with their scent, and in the far corner, zucchini sprawled out across the soil, taking up space the way children do. One afternoon in late April, Arthur and Devin stood at the edge of the garden looking at what they'd built. "She'd be proud of this," Devin said. Arthur nodded. "Yeah, she would." "Benjamin, too." Arthur smiled. "Yeah, him too." Ray came by that weekend and took a photograph. Arthur, Devin, Ethan, Sarah, and 4 other veterans standing in the garden surrounded by green. He framed it and hung it on the wall of the shop right next to the old photograph from Fallujah. Above the door, the wooden sign still read, "Every person who walks through this door has a story you don't know. Treat them accordingly." Arthur never stopped writing in his notebook. He wrote letters to the families of veterans who had no one. He wrote to Ethan's mother, who hadn't heard from her son in 2 years, and told her that her boy was safe. He wrote to the mother of Cameron Mitchell 20 years after her son's death, just to tell her that he still remembered, that he would always remember. One evening, as he sat in the garden with the notebook open on his lap, Devin asked what he was writing. Arthur looked at the page, then at Devin. "I'm writing about the way you treat the people who can do nothing for you," he said, "because that's who you really are." Devin smiled. "Where'd you learn that?" Arthur closed the notebook. "From people who showed me," he said, "and from the people I failed to show." He stood, his knees creaking, and walked toward the house. The sun was setting behind the ridge. The garden glowed in the fading light, and, for the first time in 3 years, Arthur Calloway didn't feel alone. The months continued to pass, and the transformation that had begun that Tuesday morning at Blue Ridge Arms rippled outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Tyler, who had once worn his tactical vest like armor against the world, began to understand that true strength had nothing to do with appearances. He spent his Saturdays at the VA hospital, but he also started visiting Arthur's property on Sunday afternoons. He learned to plant seeds, to pull weeds without disturbing the roots of what was growing, to wait patiently for things to emerge from the soil in their own time. One Sunday, while working beside Arthur in the tomato rows, Tyler asked a question that had been building in him for weeks. "Colonel, how do you carry it, all of it? The men you lost, your son, your wife, how do you get up in the morning?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He finished tying a tomato plant to its stake, testing the knot to make sure it was secure, but not too tight. "You carry it because you have to," he said finally, "because the alternative is to put it down, and if you put it down, you're saying it didn't matter, that they didn't matter." He moved to the next plant. "Every morning when I wake up, I remember Elaine's face. I remember Benjamin's laugh. I remember every Marine who didn't come home. And I get up because they can't, because I owe them that much." Tyler nodded slowly, understanding settling into him like water into dry earth. Marcus took a different path. The support group he'd started became the center of his life in ways he hadn't expected. He began studying trauma-informed care, reading everything he could find about PTSD, moral injury survivor's guilt. He attended workshops. He earned certifications, One Wednesday evening, after a particularly difficult session where a Vietnam veteran had broken down, describing a firefight from 1968, Marcus stayed late to clean up. Arthur had attended that night, sitting quietly in the back, and he remained after the others had left. "You're good at this," Arthur said, helping Marcus stack chairs. Marcus shook his head. "I don't feel good at it. I feel like I'm fumbling in the dark most of the time." "That's because you care," Arthur replied. "The people who think they have all the answers are the ones you have to worry about." He set a chair down and looked at Marcus directly. "You're doing something important here. These men and women, they need a place where they can talk without judgment, where someone listens without trying to fix them. You're giving them that." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "I just wish I'd understood sooner," he said. "I wish I'd treated you differently that day." "You're treating people differently now," Arthur said. "That's what matters." Devon's journey took him deepest into Arthur's world. As winter gave way to spring, he began staying longer at the property, sometimes until after dark. He learned not just how to garden, but why Elaine had designed it the way she had. The logic of companion planting, the importance of crop rotation, the way certain herbs could protect certain vegetables from pests. But more than that, he learned about Arthur. He learned that Arthur had grown up in rural Georgia, the son of a tobacco farmer who'd lost everything in the Depression. That Arthur had joined the Marines at 17 to escape poverty and found something he'd been searching for without knowing it: purpose, structure, brotherhood. He learned that Arthur and Elaine had met at a USO dance in 1975, that she'd been a school teacher who'd volunteered to chaperone, that Arthur had been too shy to ask her to dance until his buddy literally pushed him across the floor. He learned that Benjamin had been born in 1984, that he'd been a quiet kid who loved building things with his hands, that he'd joined the Marines, not because Arthur pushed him, but because he'd wanted to make his father proud. He learned that the garden had been Elaine's therapy after Benjamin deployed, that she'd pour all her worry and fear into the soil, and that it had worked until Benjamin came home changed, until the things she'd feared happened anyway, just slower and from the inside. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Devon asked, "Do you ever wish you'd done something different, made different choices?" Arthur was quiet for a long time. "I used to," he said. "For the first year after Benjamin died, I replayed every conversation we'd had, every time I told him to tough it out, every time I changed the subject when he tried to talk about what he'd seen, every time I said, 'Marines handle it,' instead of 'let's get you help.' Ja, ich sagte." He paused. "I drove myself half crazy with it. Elaine too. We'd lie awake at night going through all the what-ifs. What if we'd insisted on better treatment? What if we'd moved him back home? What if? What changed?" Devon asked. "Nothing changed," Arthur said. "I still think about it every day, but I realize that I can't undo what happened. All I can do is try to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else's son." He gestured toward the garden where Ethan and Sarah were visible in the fading light, checking on the pepper plants they put in the week before. "This," Arthur said, "this is what I can do." Ethan Graves had transformed in the months since that November night. The transitional housing Ray had found led to a job at a construction company owned by another veteran. The job led to an apartment. The apartment led to stability. But more than the external changes, something internal had shifted. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Not happiness exactly, but hope. The possibility of happiness. He came to Arthur's property 3 times a week now, sometimes to work in the garden, sometimes just to sit. Arthur never asked him to talk, but Ethan often did, sharing pieces of his story bit by bit, the way you might build something fragile from scattered parts. One Saturday in June, Ethan brought someone with him, another veteran, a woman named Claire, who'd served in the Air Force and was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. She was quiet at first, uncertain, but Arthur handed her a pair of gloves and showed her how to stake the bean plants, and by the end of the afternoon, she was laughing at something Sarah had said. The following week, Claire brought 2 more veterans. The week after that, those 2 brought 3 others. By midsummer, Arthur's 8 acres had become an unofficial refuge. On any given weekend, you might find a dozen veterans working in the expanded garden beds, sitting under the pine trees, or helping Arthur repair the fence that had sagged for so long. Ray started calling it Arthur's Battalion, though Arthur himself refused the title. "It's not mine," he'd say. "It's Elaine's, it's Benjamin's, it belongs to everyone who needs it." But Devin noticed that Arthur had started keeping a different kind of notebook. In addition to the leather journal where he wrote his letters, he now had a composition book where he tracked everyone who came to the property, their names, their service history, what they were struggling with, what resources they'd been connected to. He never showed this notebook to anyone, but Devin caught glimpses of it sometimes. Page after page of careful handwriting, names and notes, a record of the living. In July, something unexpected happened. Arthur received a phone call from a woman named Patricia Mitchell. She was calling, she said, because she'd received a letter from him, the 20th letter he'd sent over the years, always on the anniversary of her son Cameron's death. "I wanted you to know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that those letters have meant everything to me, every single one. They're how I know my son, the real him, not just my little boy, but the man he became." Arthur, sitting at his kitchen table with the phone pressed to his ear, found himself unable to speak. "I'm driving through Virginia next month," Patricia continued. "I wonder, would it be all right if I stopped by? I'd like to meet you in person, to thank you." Arthur closed his eyes. "Of course," he managed. "That would be an honor." She came on a Tuesday in August, 20 years and 3 months after her son's death. Patricia Mitchell was a small woman in her early 70s with gray hair and Cameron's eyes. She stood in Arthur's driveway for a long moment after getting out of her car, looking at the house, the garden, the land. Arthur walked out to meet her, and when she saw him, she began to cry. "Colonel Calloway," she said. "Arthur, please." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Arthur, I've wanted to meet you for so long." They sat on the porch, and Arthur told her stories about Cameron that he'd never put in the letters. Small things, the way Cameron always volunteered to take point, the terrible jokes he'd tell to break tension, the photograph of his mother he'd kept in his helmet. "He talked about you," Arthur said. "The night before the operation, he told me about how you'd raised him by yourself after his father died, how you'd worked 2 jobs to put him through school, how proud he was to make you proud." Patricia's hands trembled in her lap. "I was so angry for so long," she said. "Angry at the war, angry at the Marine Corps, angry at God. But your letters, they helped me see that Cameron's life mattered, that he wasn't just a casualty, he was a person who made a difference." Arthur reached over and took her hand. "He saved lives," he said, "including mine. If he and the others hadn't held that position as long as they did, my whole command would have walked into an ambush. Cameron Mitchell is the reason a lot of Marines came home." They sat together until the sun began to set. Before she left, Patricia walked through the garden with Arthur, and he showed her the newest section, a row of sunflowers that had been planted by the veterans who gathered there. "Cameron loved sunflowers," she said softly. "I know," Arthur replied. "He told me. That's why they're here." The weeks that followed Patricia's visit brought a new energy to the property. Word had spread through veteran networks about the garden, about Ray's shop, about the community that had formed around a 72-year-old man who'd been mocked in a gun store and turned that moment into something redemptive. A reporter from the local paper came to do a story. Arthur refused to be interviewed, but he allowed her to talk to the others: Devin, Ethan, Sarah, Marcus. The article ran on a Sunday, and by Wednesday, Arthur had received 47 phone calls from veterans, family members, and people who just wanted to help. Ray fielded most of the calls, directing people to resources, taking names, organizing volunteers. Blue Ridge Arms had become something between a community center and a mission control for veteran services in the region. The sign above the door had been joined by others: a bulletin board covered with information, a donation box for the transitional housing program, a coffee station that was always full, a shelf of books about trauma and recovery. Tyler had quit working at the shop to go to school for social work. Marcus had started a nonprofit, formalized the support groups, and secured grant funding. Devon had moved into the small apartment above Ray's garage and was taking online classes in agricultural therapy. But through all of this growth and change, the center remained the same: Arthur's garden, Elaine's design, Benjamin's memory. It was late September, 1 year after Arthur had walked into Blue Ridge Arms, when something happened that brought everything full circle. Arthur was working in the garden on a Saturday afternoon, showing a young Iraq veteran named Thomas how to harvest tomatoes without damaging the vine, when a car pulled into the driveway. A man got out. He was in his late 30s, wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable, carrying a briefcase. He stood for a moment looking around with an expression Arthur couldn't quite read. Arthur straightened his back, protesting, and walked toward the driveway. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man turned to face him. His eyes were red, as if he'd been crying. "Are you Arthur Calloway?" he asked. "I am." The man's face crumpled. He set down the briefcase and extended his hand, which was shaking. "My name is David Chen," he said. I was Cameron Mitchell's best friend. We went through boot camp together. I was at his funeral." Arthur took his hand. "I received a letter from Mrs. Mitchell last month," David continued. "She told me about this place, about what you're doing here, and I needed to come." He paused, struggling to compose himself. "I've been struggling for 20 years, sir. I got out after Cameron died, went to college, got a job, got married, did everything I was supposed to do, but I've been drowning the whole time, and I didn't know how to ask for help." Arthur guided him to the porch, and they sat. Over the next 2 hours, David talked about survivor's guilt, about the nightmares that had never stopped, about the marriage that was falling apart, about the successful career that felt hollow, about the shame of struggling when he hadn't even been wounded. Arthur listened, and when David finally ran out of words, Arthur said simply, "You're not alone, and you don't have to be." He called Ray. He called Marcus. He called Ethan. Within an hour, David Chen was surrounded by people who understood, not because they'd been in his exact circumstances, but because they'd all carried their own versions of the same weight. By the time David left that evening, he had phone numbers, resources, and an invitation to return the following weekend. He also had something else: a tomato plant in a pot grown from seeds that had been saved from Elaine's original planting 32 years ago. "Take care of this," Arthur said, handing it to him. "Water it, watch it grow, and when it produces fruit, save some of the seeds and plant them again. That's how things survive. That's how we survive." David took the plant with trembling hands and nodded. As his car disappeared down the driveway, Devin came to stand beside Arthur. "You think he'll be okay?" Devin asked. I think he's got a better chance now than he did this morning, Arthur replied. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the garden. You know what I realize, Devin said. That day at the shop when Ray told us who you were, I thought the story was about respect, about treating veterans better, about honor. It was about those things, Arthur said. Yeah, but it's about more than that too. It's about what happens after. It's about what you build from the broken pieces. Arthur smiled. Took me a long time to figure that out. How long? About 72 years. They both laughed, and the sound carried across the garden where a dozen veterans were working, talking healing in their own ways and their own time. That night, alone in his house, Arthur opened his leather notebook and wrote, 1 year ago, 3 young men laughed at me in a gun store. They saw an old man, a punchline, someone not worth their time. They were wrong about me, but that's not the important part. The important part is what happened next, how Ray chose to respond, how those 3 young men chose to change, how one act of disrespect became a catalyst for something larger than any of us. Benjamin used to ask me what made a good Marine. I told him it was discipline, courage, loyalty. I was right, but I was also incomplete. What makes a good Marine, what makes a good person is the willingness to see your own failures and do something about them, to take the moment when you fell short and use it as the foundation for something better. Tyler, Marcus, and Devin could have made excuses, could have forgotten about the old man in the chair. Instead, they chose to transform. Ray could have fired them. Instead, he chose to teach them. I could have left bitter. Instead, I chose to stay open. And now, a year later, we have this. A garden full of people growing things. A gun shop that saves lives instead of just selling weapons. A community built on the simple idea that every person has a story worth knowing. Elaine would have loved this. She always said the best gardens are the ones where people plant things together. Benjamin would have been proud. He wanted to serve something larger than himself. In a way, he still is. Every veteran who finds their way here, every person who learns they're not alone, that's Benjamin's legacy too. I don't know how many years I have left. My knees hurt. My back aches. I get tired easier than I used to, but I'm not done yet. Because every week someone new shows up. Someone who's struggling. Someone who thinks they're broken beyond repair. Someone who just needs to know that they matter. And I get to tell them, you're not broken. You're not alone. And your story isn't over. That's worth waking up for. That's worth every single morning. He closed the notebook and set it on the table beside Elaine's reading glasses and the photograph of his family when they'd all still been together. Outside, the garden waited for tomorrow. The tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. The herbs perfumed the air. The zucchini sprawled in the corner where Benjamin had helped plant them so many years ago. And in town, above the door of a gun shop, a wooden sign reminded everyone who passed beneath it. Every person who walks through this door has a story you don't know. Treat them accordingly. The way you treat the people who can do nothing for you, Arthur had said, that's who you really are. It had become more than a philosophy. It had become a lifeline. And it all started because a 72-year-old man walked into a store, got laughed at, and chose to sit down and wait instead of walking away angry. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with patience, with dignity, with the quiet refusal to let other people's cruelty define who you are. Sometimes the greatest victories look like a garden full of broken people learning to grow again. Sometimes legacy isn't about the medals you earned or the ranks you achieved. It's about the seeds you planted and who carries them forward when you're gone. Arthur Calloway understood this now in a way he hadn't when he'd first retired, when Elaine had first gotten sick, When Benjamin had first come home changed from war, he understood that you can't save everyone, but you can show up, you can listen, you can create space for people to heal in their own time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that's enough. The garden grew, the community expanded, the work continued, and every morning when Arthur Calloway woke at 5:30 a.m., he had a reason to get up. Not because the pain had stopped, not because the loss had disappeared, but because there was still work to be done, still people who needed to know they weren't alone, still seeds to plant and tend and harvest, still stories that deserved to be heard, still lives that mattered, still hope stubborn and green pushing up through the soil,